Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of what's the name of our show? The Gio and Joey Show. I got so many podcasts going on. We have a special guest and friend, Dr. Nicholas Miller. How are you today?
It's great to be with you both, and yeah, I'm doing fine, thanks.
All right, Joey, I'll let you start us off. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have Dr. Miller on the podcast. Especially because of his experience with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has been in the news quite a bit lately. Um, so I guess kind of just to get the ball rolling, what has been probably the number one thing you've been paying attention to with some of the Supreme Court news that's been grabbing the headlines?
Boy, the number one thing, I mean, there's so much going on. It's like a fire hydrant that of cases and issues. I've probably been following some of the rulings and issues around the immigration question.
Hmm.
I felt very deeply and very strongly about issues of due process with some, not just undocumented migrants, but some people who hold green cards being taken and held and moved around the country and even moved out of the country. And, a lot of that is just pretty blatantly, at least in the past, we would have thought of it as pretty blatantly unconstitutional. And so watching how the courts are responding to that and trying to rein in the administration, and then how the Supreme Court has reacted, has been a very real interest to me. And I've tried to follow those developments at some level of detail. I must confess that last week I was all week in South Africa. I work with Interfaith Forum of the G20. It's a group of religious leaders and religious freedom experts that try to influence the G20 Economic Summit on issues of international policy. And so I was all week in South Africa, a little bit away from the US news. And with the way things are happening these days, it's like every week is like a
Hmm.
whole year's worth of new information about the Supreme Court and issues. So you just shared a couple of things with me that I hadn't actually caught up on in relation to the president even starting to criticize conservative lawyers and judges and the Federalist Society, which
Hmm.
previously, especially in his first term, he worked fairly closely with. So anyway, that's kind of a longish answer, and you may want to
Okay.
focus a bit.
Well, I have a follow up to that because you said your concern is with the due process. How to explain to the lay folk, myself too, because I don't dive too deep in it. What's the balance of due process with the notion that if you come here illegally and let's say there are 21 million, it could take 10, 12 years to go through that. So how do you balance that? The sovereignty of the
Well,
nation with the fact that you want to have due
yeah,
process.
no, that's a fair question, and it's at a fundamental level, I think we would all agree that if you're an American citizen or if you have a green card, that you should not be able to be removed from the country, at least absent some, horrendous crime that I don't think we do exile anymore, right? Um, Even if you commit a crime, you basically have the right to stay in the United States. So the question is, if somebody is picked up and is assumed to be an illegal alien or an undocumented immigrant, um, do they have at least the due process to show that they're not, or that they are a resident, or do have a green card, right? Because if you say no, they get no hearing,
Hmm.
then do you carry your passport around with you? Like, I don't know what your ethnicities are, but
Hmm.
you could be mistaken for Hispanics anyway. And if somebody just stopped you and said, "Hey, do you have your passport? Do you have your immigration papers?" Well, I don't
Mm.
carry that around with me. You may have a driver's license, but undocumented immigrants in many states can get driver's licenses.
Hmm.
And then you can't show your passport, and they say, hey, you're brown, you may even speak Spanish. We think you're not, and we're just going to take you and hold you in prison and put you on a plane and send you away.
Hmm.
Well, you at least need a hearing before an officer where you can say, well, I don't have my passport on me, but look, I can make a call. My wife can bring it. I can show documentation, right? So at least you should have, if you don't have at least that level of due process, then there's nothing to stop people from just ICE from grabbing full-blown citizens and green card holders and sending them away.
Legal kidnapping.
And you've got to, and even people who think all the undocumented immigrants should be sent away tomorrow. I think we would agree that you should at least do it in a way that stops you from sending away documented
Hmm.
immigrants and green card holders and citizens. So that's why at least some level of due process is necessary.
What does
And
the well?
one
Go ahead,
follow
Joey.
up. Well, I was just going to say one follow up on that. And to your point, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it that generally speaking, when it comes to like the fundamental rights of the Constitution, right, particularly the 14th Amendment, says that those are to be applied to persons within the United States, right? So not just citizens. So like if you're, I mean, obviously there's, limits on like, I'm sure guns and stuff, but like the basic kind of process rights, aren't they generally seen to be applied to anyone within the United States? Or
Yeah, they are applied to persons within the United States, and it's recognized that you do have different levels of rights depending on whether you are an American citizen, whether you are a green card holder, or whether you're some other kind of visa holder, or
Hmm.
even if you're entirely illegal and undocumented. Let's say you're illegal and undocumented. Well, the the government still can't treat you with cruel and unusual punishment, for instance, right?
Hmm.
That applies to everybody, um, and they can't put you in jail for the rest of your life, right? That would be a violation of due process. They have to give you a hearing and determine that you are, in fact, undocumented, but they still have to treat you with a certain level of basic dignity and respect that the 14th Amendment and other amendments to the Constitution require. So some people don't like it, but yes, you're right. Persons are protected, not just citizens.
Is there a
And I think it's an important.
no? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and that's consistent with the underlying philosophy. The underlying political philosophy of the Constitution is found in the Declaration of Independence, right? And in the Declaration of Independence, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So the basis of the fundamental rights of the Constitution are based on your created human dignity. And that is not given to you by the government when it makes you a citizen or a green card holder. It's given to you by God when he makes you a person. And so the rights of the Constitution, at least the fundamental ones, apply to everyone, all persons.
Is there a
and,
time limit on that? Like, for example, there seems to be a delay, Joey. Is there like a time limit? I heard somebody talk about that. If they catch you like in the act, they don't have to give you that due process. They just ship you right back or within a month or something. Is there a time limit on that?
If they catch you in the act of what?
Crossing the border.
Oh, crossing the border. Yeah, so actually there is a difference between people who have actually entered the United States versus those who are still outside. Um, and once they have entered into the territory of the United States, and usually there's a request for asylum, right? People just don't
Hmm.
come here and say, I have no legal right to be here. they usually come and say, I am seeking asylum, because America has a category of
Mm-hmm.
certain countries because of disasters or civil wars that you're persecuted for your religion, that you can seek asylum. So they'll say, I want to seek asylum. And at that time, they will be held provisionally and said, okay, well, we'll let you stay here for 3 months. And I'm not an immigration lawyer. I mean, I took a
Mm-hmm.
class in it and I've done a few minor things, but I can't remember the exact time periods. But they'll look into their asylum claim and see if it's well founded or not. And if it's not well founded, they send them back. And if it is well founded, they may allow them to stay on.
Okay. Okay.
So outside of the immigration debate and the due process, which I definitely agree with you. I think one of the things I would say that I try to get through to people is like, listen, I consider myself somewhat like, I think we should be open to immigration, but I think, for instance, the last 4 years, I think things got a little, well, more than a little out of hand. But what I would say what I try to get through to people is what you don't understand is due process or free speech or whatever these things, it seems to me like it's most important to defend it when the person you're defending it for isn't popular, right? Whether it was, then free speech, right? The ACLU defending the right of Nazis to march in Skokie, right? Nobody likes Nazis, but like their speech had to be protected to protect all of our speech. And, the same thing, like, yeah, maybe I mean, not even maybe. I know some of the people that the Trump administration is deporting have been a part of MS-13 and other things. But it's like, if you allow the government to just say that, well, they can start by saying it to this group that's unpopular. But then what happens when they want to say it about you, right? And if you've gotten rid of the protection, right, it's in your own self-interest to defend due process rights. So,
That's right.
is there any
No, that's absolutely
is there
right.
any outside of immigration, are there any of the other kind of major cases that have stuck out to you or that you've been keeping an eye on?
Well, probably the cases involving the reduction of government workers. I mean, as an Adventist, I was deeply disturbed by the assault on USAID, for instance, because you're both familiar with the Adventist Development
Adra.
and Relief
Yeah, yeah.
Agency,
Adra.
ADRA. And ADRA gets a significant amount of its funding, two-thirds of its funding, from USAID. And I've got friends that work there, and I can tell you that that funding is accounted for, down to the penny. I mean, it's really hard there's a tremendous amount of oversight. And ADRA, if you know anything about it, is a really leanly run organization, and they do like really amazing work in keeping hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people kind of alive in certain troubled spots of the world, because they're not a government agency. They're kind of a neutral third party agency that can go into places that may be mad at the US or not happy with Western countries or whatever, and provide a way, a conduit for food and water and supplies and relief to people who are suffering because of natural disasters or civil wars. And I mean, they do just like critical work in basic necessities for a variety of people. And it was appalling to me how unelected officials were appointed but not confirmed by the government, and just went in and kind of unilaterally decided to start withholding money that had been budgeted and given by the Congress, congressional vote. Our representatives had decided this money was to be spent in this way. Not just ADRA, but a variety of other development organizations hire people, run organizations based on this money coming through to provide benefits to some of the poorest people in the world. And it's not just do-gooding for the sake of do-gooding, right? This really represents American soft power influence in maintaining support and stability in places of the world that if that support and stability goes away, there could be even greater refugee crises that eventually impact us, for instance. Things we do in Central and South America that if we stop doing, humanitarian situations are going to spiral down and immigration pressure is going to increase. And it's kind of like a cutting your nose to spite your face. And you can argue over the policies about, well, what is this money really doing? Or is it actually helping the migrants come over the border? But what really offended me as a constitutional lawyer and someone who cares about the way our government works is that these decisions were being made in a complete violation of our constitutional Republican form of government, right? We have a government of laws, not of men. We don't have czars that can just step in and decide to overturn government programs irrespective of what Congress has decided. And a tremendous amount was done that was allowed to be done because these programs weren't widely understood or popular by many Americans, right? They don't know what's happening with the USAID and this funding that's happening overseas. So there wasn't the kind of public uprising that probably should have taken place if people had really understood the incredibly unconstitutional and unlawful things that were being carried out by a few individuals in just withholding millions of dollars from programs that were underway. I mean, Address had to lay off dozens, if not hundreds of people, and may have to lay off more and just end programs, despite the courts ruling that this was in fact unconstitutional. I'll pause there to allow you to get a question.
Yeah. No. Go ahead, Joey.
Wound up on this one.
Well, so yeah, and while I do, and again, this criticism of USAID is like line item things, because I totally agree with you that there is a good place for American soft power. I mean, before he was confirmed, I mean, like even like a year or two ago, the now Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was praising a lot of the programs of USAID. But to
Right.
anybody watching, maybe they're more pro the administration or whatever, like America first and these things, what I would say is to them is the other thing we have to think about, right? And this administration claims to be like hawkish on the Chinese threat. Well, China is, with their Belt and Road Initiative, is more than happy to pick up the slack in Latin America and Africa and, obviously in the Asian theater, right? Because they want that influence, right? And so just America deciding to get rid of programs that, it had that were doing critical work in these areas, it's like ceding, in a lot of ways, America's authority to like our number one enemy. And I'm like, well, that seems like, again, to cut your nose to spite your face. And so that was one of the things that stuck out with me and why I agree. And the other thing is like, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, but one of the things that I noticed about all this is the change in like the Christian right portion of it, right? Because like I remember as a kid, President Bush, one of the things that he highlighted was he thought it as like a good Christian thing to like, is it PEPFAR or PrEPFAR? I forget exactly what the program, but it was like one of his signature programs with USAID. And that the Christian right generally supported to help with malaria, or not malaria, AIDS treatment around the world. Yeah. And this was like a wildly successful program, one that Christians in America helped support and get in place. And then what you said about, ADRA losing and other Christian charities, right? This whole idea of Christian charities like stepping up into the public square and getting support, that had been a major part of like the conservative movement, and now that seems to kind of be thrown out. So have you noticed that change? Or
Yeah, we called it compassionate conservatism, didn't we? And George Bush and the Thousand Points of Light, and there was a thought that America could do good in the world, and conservatives were on board with that, and Christian leaders were on board with that, and I mean, I think a lot of this came quite a bit as a surprise, and it was Doge, right, and Elon
Hmm.
Musk who kind of stepped in and started implementing policies that I certainly hadn't heard as part of the campaign. Like I don't recall Trump or anyone saying, "Oh, we're going to cut, USAID and all those programs." And certainly we can have the policy debate, and Republicans control Congress, and so they could have implemented this in a lawful way and made these arguments, and we could have had the debate. And we could have said, but look, China is stepping in and filling these vacuums, and it seems very short-sighted of us. But the point is, there was no debate. It was just one man went in with a chainsaw and started slashing, right, the budgets of programs. And I was following this fairly closely at the time because I was doing some consulting on some of these matters. And it was amazing how judges said you can't freeze these funds, you have to unfreeze them. And the government just ignored it. Like the money didn't start flowing. And people, I don't think most people know how much, like some of this, like when the planes were flying to El Salvador and the
Hmm.
judge said, you can't do that. And the planes kept flying. I mean, there's been a couple of things where the press has focused on the fact that the administration seemed to just ignore court orders. But on this question of the USAID funding, there were just court orders, several orders by judges that were essentially ignored. And this is highlighting, they talk about the Supreme Court, the court system being the least dangerous branch. They just don't have an enforcement mechanism to
Hmm.
carry out the orders that they give. It's the U.S. Marshals that will go and arrest people or hold people or detain people. But who operate the U.S. Marshals? Well, it's the executive branch of the government.
Hmm.
So if the U.S. Marshals are told one thing by a judge, but then the administration tells them another thing, you basically have a constitutional crisis.
Let me jump
Um,
in. Let me jump in here with that, right? Because I think I sense some of the frustration on both sides of the aisle. So I'm not just talking Republican or Democrat. It's this notion that Congress, in the last, I say, 2 decades, has seemed to stop actually working. It's become so bipartisan. They don't pass laws, and we have seen the growth of the executive power. And what can you enlighten me with that, or just share with the audience? Because it seems like they're polarizing, where they don't do anything themselves. So the executive says, "Oh well, let me run rampant." And Trump seems to have the idea of, "Let me try whatever, and then I'll let the courts decide." You know what I mean? So it's like,
yeah,
how do you? Because that's frustrating. Our
yeah.
congressmen aren't doing anything.
Well, yeah, and there's certain political gridlock, and political
Hmm.
gridlock benefits authoritarian presidential leaders. And we can't blame all of this on Trump by any means.
Hmm.
I mean, historians have noted the growth of something that's been called the imperial presidency over the last 2 or 3 decades, right?
Hmm.
Probably ever since Ronald Reagan. And he was a soft imperial president, right? He was like the uncle of the country, and he was positive and uplifting, morning in America, and but there was a definite growth of presidential and executive power, and it did not, and it was followed in Clinton, George Bush the second,
Hmm.
the kinds of decisions to go to war, decisions to use power, decisions to set up, Guantanamo Bay, the treatment of prisoners. A lot of this was done just through the executive branch. There's been an increase of executive orders. Obama followed in that pattern to some
Hmm.
degree.
Hmm.
And Trump won to some degree. Um, and Biden, continued that. But and people like to, oh, this is just something that's been, but what's happened in the last 4 months has
Hmm.
taken that imperial presidency and put it on steroids, right? It, it's been taken to levels that no previous president I mean, at least going back to Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson was the president in the 1830s, 40s that, said the Supreme Court has made its decision, now it can enforce it, and refused to accede to a decision about and again, it was about the treatment of minority groups. It was about Native
Hmm.
Americans being removed from their lands to another land and, to some reservations. Um, but you can't really, there's nothing really between that time and the time we're in now where a president has seemed to be so dismissive of court opinions and attacking individual justices and judges or in when they rule against him. It's been quite remarkable.
So let me put from our faith perspective a little religious spin on it. Regardless of what's happened in the 4 months, he's still very popular according to the polls, right? And so obviously
Seems to be.
on one side we see the rise of Christian nationalism, which for the three of us that raises an eyebrow, knowing what we know prophetically. How do you see that combination? Because look, I don't know, you can't say, well, this is how I put it. I wouldn't let Trump marry my daughter, right? Because that's what I think of him morally, right? But I don't think he is a religious zealot, right? Like, so but yet he's authoritative in a way. How do you see that balance, right? Because is he a man of the people? Is he going to go along to get along? Will he push back? Because it seems like a powder keg is rising between the two, Christian nationalism and his administration.
Yeah. I mean, nobody's confused Donald Trump for a religious man. Um, but he has positioned himself as a champion of religious people and religious
Mm-hmm.
causes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, and certainly he likes to portray himself as an authoritarian, right?
Mm-hmm.
He refers to himself as King Trump. Now, I think he's trolling people a little bit,
Yeah.
right? He's trying to get a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But he also openly admires other authoritarian leaders, like Putin and Viktor Orban and the North Korea president. So um, he's in favor of authoritarian rule. Um, I mean, and yet, the Christians are not necessarily in favor of dictators for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But when there's a dictator or an authoritarian person who's wanting to press the Christian agenda, they have a hard time
Saying
saying
no.
no or
Yeah.
being critical. And, in our faith tradition, we have Ellen White, who has spoken,
Mm-hmm.
we believe, prophetically about a variety of topics. And she talks about not just the violation of freedom of conscience, but she talks about every principle of our Constitution
Mm-hmm.
will be set aside. And she talks about, the beast of Revelation 13 with lamb-like horns,
Mm-hmm.
two horns like a lamb. And she and our pioneers believed that those horns represented the positive Christ-like use of power,
Mm-hmm.
and that these represented freedom of conscience,
Mm-hmm.
the freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and the other horn was republicanism, not Republican Party, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
form of government of republicanism, Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is reflected in the rule of law, the equal application of law, the checks and balances of our governmental system. And so, when we see, so we have the religious Christian nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
which is going to try to make laws regarding religion, which violates the one horn of the republic of
Mm-hmm.
Protestantism, the separation of church and state. But then you have the authoritarianism, which is attacking the Republican form of government, which
Mm-hmm.
is representing that other horn, and the two together cause America to speak more and more loudly as a dragon.
Yeah.
So both of these things have been predicted.
Yeah. The Christian nationalism, I don't know how much time you spend on X, formerly known as Twitter, but I've had conversation with Christian nationalists that they're ready to put the sword in. They don't care who's in charge. Catholics, Baptists,
Yeah,
Presbyterians, as long as it's Christianity. And it surprises me in the sense from their standpoint is that they're aware that they may not agree if it's a Baptist or Presbyterian or Catholic, but they would rather have that than, what the perceived liberal side of the last 4 years, which had its own moral failings as well. But
sure.
so you see the rise of that, at least in social media, and from what we know prophetically, that's very alarming.
Well, look, Trump is not a young man.
Hmm.
And some of
Oldest
his
president,
speeches
right?
more recently, the oldest president ever, and he's going to be,
Hmm.
in his early 80s by the time he's through.
Yeah.
Um, the oldest elected president,
Hmm.
right? I mean, because how old was Biden when he was elected? Because I think Biden was older at the end of his
Yeah.
presidency.
Hmm.
Um,
I think Biden
but,
was
but
78. I think Biden was the same age as Trump when he was elected, I
when
believe.
he was elected,
Hmm.
um, so
Ah.
the he's not going to last forever. And look who's vice president, right? JD Vance is a religious man. He is, in fact, he converted to Catholicism a few years ago. And, just because you're a Catholic doesn't mean you're against religious freedom or civil
Yeah, yeah.
liberties. There are many
Hmm.
Catholics who are very supportive of that. Some of the uh, Supreme Court justices that are Catholic are supportive of separation of church and state. And in the past, that's been true. But J.D. Vance has been connected with a particular form of Catholicism, a philosophical school known as integralism. And integralism is a philosophy within Catholic thought, scholarly thought, of bringing the integral relationship between church and state that used to exist in the Middle Ages before the rise of Western democracies and the separation of church and state. And they feel that secular liberalism has run its course, has shown itself to be weak and ineffective, and that there needs to be a return to this integral relationship and cooperation between church and state that used to characterize Western Christendom, back before the Protestant revolutions. So that's the man we have who's a heartbeat away from the presidency
Hmm.
and potentially, conceivably, the future of the Republican Party, right? The vice president is usually the heir apparent to the throne, as they say these days.
In one of the earliest polls, he's way ahead, 47% for the next nomination. Go ahead.
Is that
Well, I,
right? I
I,
hadn't
I
seen
Yeah.
that.
I'll just put out a little plug for my friends over in the new Reagan caucus. We're working very hard to make sure that 2028 primary is competitive. We do not want Vice President Vance to be the nominee. But
Who?
as you were speaking, I'm glad you brought up integralism, particularly with the link with JD Vance. I actually want to shout out a friend of mine's podcast. It's called Why Post Liberalism Failed. And anybody who wants to know what Dr. Miller's talking about, check out that podcast. It's with my friend Thomas Howes, who's actually the leader of the New Reagan Caucus. And he's a Catholic. He's a conservative Catholic, but he's a fan of American constitutionalism, free markets, and these things. And so him and his co-host, who's also a Catholic academic, they basically did a podcast. It's in response to a book by Patrick Deneen called Why Liberalism Failed. But their podcast is Why Post-Liberalism Failed. And they go through this history of Catholic post-liberalism and integralism. And they show how it's a really bad idea, right? And even from their Catholic perspective, they talk about Franco. They talk about, I think it was Salazar in Portugal, and some of these figures, particularly in the 20th century, who did have this taste for integralism and got a chance at it, and it didn't work out so well, even for the Catholics. And so I just would encourage anyone, if they want to know more about what Dr. Miller's talking about with integralism, check out that podcast. Um,
Yeah, I'd love to get a link to that. Sounds interesting.
and I want to get them on here to talk about it eventually. But no, I think you were spot on in pointing to, and this is something that sometimes in our faith tradition, I feel like a lack of precision in criticism of, say, the right or certain things that are happening with the administration actually hurts our argument. But I like that you directly went to integralism, or like when Gio was talking, you went to Christian nationalism. And so I think this is a good point to kind of switch, right? In other words, so when people, we've talked a lot about what we disagree with this administration, but you've also talked about like moral philosophy and actual Christian involvement with politics. And so how can a person of conscience who wants to be a good citizen, they want to be faithful to their faith in the public square, how can they go about as a Christian being a faithful presence in politics?
Well, that's a great question, because often the response to Christian nationalism is that Christians should stay out of politics.
Yeah. Nope.
And and that's what's created the problem in many ways, right? That's why we have this extreme secular liberalism, which is trying to send, men into women's restrooms and sports, and changing the genders of kids, and letting abortion run riot. And it's like we believed in a separation of church and state to begin with, but that became a separation of morality in the state, which is deeply problematic. And this moral philosophy that you've mentioned, a few years ago, I came across this Ellen White quote where she said, "There's three things we should especially study in our schools: moral philosophy, the Bible, and physical education, along with the things we usually study." And I was like, this moral philosophy, like most Adventists don't know what that is. Have you ever had a class in moral philosophy? And they usually say, oh, and then she says the Bible. So really she means morality is found in the Bible. But she doesn't, right? Physical education is a separate thing from biblical study, and biblical study is a separate thing from moral philosophy. And in her day, moral philosophy was understood as the study of moral issues, right and wrong, from sources other than special revelation, from human history, from conscience, from rational insight, from human intuition, right? There's a variety of sources of arriving at right and wrong. And the reason that's so important is that one of the reasons is that in a country with separation of church and state, if you say, I only get my morality from the Bible, then you have nothing to say in the public square,
Yeah.
because by definition, you can't use your religion to make moral arguments. And after Ellen White, and our pioneers were very conversant with the use of moral philosophy. They used it against slavery, they used it against alcohol use, they used it against imperialism and white supremacy. But after Ellen White dies, we kind of join up with the fundamentalists and say, oh no, the Bible has all the morality we need and the only morality we need, and we're going to stay away from this worldly philosophy. And we put ourselves in a position where when the 70s came along with the sexual revolution and abortion and LGBT and all of that, we said, oh, we know the truths on this, and the Bible says, but we only spoke to our church and to
Yeah. We
people who
abandoned the
believed in the
town
Bible.
square. Yep.
We abandoned the town square, and we didn't have the arguments based on history and psychology and biology that makes up what we call moral philosophy. And many other Protestant Christians didn't either, because they experienced the same thing we did. They abandoned philosophy, they went to the Bible only. And the only group that didn't do that in good part were the Catholics, who have this
Yep.
long history of a natural law tradition of dealing with issues of right and wrong through the natural law. And so when the time came for the conservative revolution, the Reagan revolution, the Bush revolution, and they said, oh, we need justices on the Supreme Court who are going to support a more conservative view of morality, they had to choose from Catholic justices. Why are there 6 Catholic justices on the Supreme Court? There is like no Protestant justices on the Supreme Court. Maybe there's one who was a Catholic and became an Episcopalian, which is kind of like being a Catholic
Yeah.
anyway.
Catholic cousin.
And the answer is because they didn't abandon moral philosophy. And if we had followed Ellen White and we hadn't abandoned moral philosophy, we would have more to say and more effective ways of saying it in the public square.
That's why a person like Charlie Kirk, you're familiar with Charlie Kirk?
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
know him a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why he can be both good and bad, right? Because sometimes you listen to him and he's like spot on, right? He's not defending things based on scripture. He's defending it on moral philosophy. But then he kind of rubbing a little, in certain episodes, he rubs a little too much shoulders with Christian nationalism, right? And so that's that balance where it's not easy. And I think that's where a lot of Protestants abandon it, because it's not easy to toe that line between deep, meaningful involvement without crossing that line into Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying. I don't know, is Charlie Kirk, is he a Protestant or a Catholic, or I'm not actually
No, he's
familiar with
Protestant. He's Protestant, and he's
Is
the
he
Sabbath
Protestant?
keeper. He's the
Okay,
seventh-day
interesting.
Sabbath keeper, yeah, but he's not Advent.
So there is a version of moral philosophy and natural law thinking that is distinctly Catholic, that tends to incorporate Catholic teaching and belief into its moral
No,
philosophy.
he's staunch anti-Catholic. He had a good debate with
I see.
Michael Knowles from
Okay.
Daily Wire.
Well, but there is a Protestant version of natural philosophy and natural law, which is rooted in, I would say, in the philosophy of men like James Madison and John Locke, which is gives much more emphasis to freedom, individual freedom, and equality, and is an alternative to both the Catholic version of natural law and an alternative to what we might call the liberal progressive philosophical outlook that's often overlooked. And I think we as Adventists, especially with our kind of Ellen Whitehead insights into this natural law thing, if you look up natural law in her writings, you'll discover that she says the preaching of the three angels' messages must be accompanied by a promotion of the natural law. So she understood that this had to go hand in glove with our biblical message. So we can't abandon that. And we have an alternative to the Catholic version of it.
Yeah.
No, I like that. And I feel like we do need to talk about this a lot more in our churches, because I can't count the number of times when in a political discussion with a fellow Adventist, they'll be like, when I start talking about like natural law and right, like the fact that when it comes to the last 6 commandments, we have some things to say about politics and like abortion.
Yeah.
Like, I went to the March for Life a couple years ago, and people are like, oh, be careful, that's a Catholic Trojan horse. I'm like, no, babies are human beings, and justice
Right.
demands that we speak for them. And so I just think having that, and then Roger Williams, of course, I love, and I know you're familiar with him, and like differentiating that the second tablet of the commandments should be followed by the government, right? When they act against them. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying you need a direct law. You can't have a direct law, thou shalt not covet, right? That how's the government going to enforce
Not
what people
exhaustive.
think?
It's
But principles.
it's not an exhaustive. Yes, the principles, not exhaustive application, but the principles are there. Absolutely.
And I'll give you a shout out, Dr. Miller, because I took one of your classes. Larry, this was initiated by Larry. She was reading about a guy Trump wanted to appoint for labor, not the main position, but like a deputy position who's pro Sunday legislation. And she wrote out a whole, who was it?
No. What's his name? It's Joel. It's Joel something, isn't it?
Oh, I don't remember.
It's
My
not
wife
the
would there.
person I said, but
Well,
I think it's
anyway,
Joel something.
she ended up writing something out, and we wrote our senators, both our senators in Oklahoma, because I remember you had that as one of our assignments. And it's going back to what we're talking about of how we can get involved. And I shared it with my church, and I invited them if they felt the same concern. Not that I was demanding it of them, but if they felt the same concern, use our letter as a template and reach out to our senators. Because, one of the things for me is, from our prophetic understanding, is even though I want to go home, right? Heaven, even though I don't want my girls, I know I'm called to kind of hold back the winds of strife as much as I can to try to save as many as I can. And so
Amen.
We have to be involved. We can't abandon the public square, but that's where we need the Holy Spirit guidance to balance that thin line.
And the name of that guy that's being nominated by the Trump administration to the vote is Jonathan Berry. So
Yes.
if anybody's watching, care about
Mhm.
religious liberty, that would be a good place to let your legislators know that you may have some issues with Jonathan Berry. But one of the things that comes to my mind, right, is how we can get involved, right? And I'd like to get your opinion on this. But it's like, how do we balance the line between making good allies, right, with, say, non-Adventists that are working in the public square? I know we just had a conservative guy on last week who's been talking about, he's very much on the right, as I am, but he was talking about like the woke right, or this idea of anti-Semitism and this kind of more authoritarian right, and calling it out. How would you say we balance having good, like, even, use the E word that some people get a little like ecumenical dialogues, but also not compromising our faith? Because I know that's a concern for some Adventists.
Well, I mean, again, our pioneers had a real set a real model for this. Ellen White spoke to her largest audiences of her life. They were non-Adventist audiences, and they were gathered to deal with the issue of alcohol and temperance reform, right? Passing laws, legislation, involved in politics. And she would speak to and cooperate with people across the religious spectrum because they had this shared common concern, right? This wasn't about watering down our beliefs and worshiping with other people and compromising our faith. It was about just strongly uniting regarding convictions that we shared in the public square. And that gives us an opportunity to share our convictions about other things. In the past, when the Biden administration or Democratic administration was in power, I used to think that the topic of marriage was one that we could unite on with many other evangelicals, right? And marriage happens to be the one of the two institutions from Eden.
Yep.
Right? There were two institutions from Eden that God gave humanity before the fall, and one is marriage, and the other is the what?
The Sabbath.
The
Oh, the Sabbath. Yeah,
Sabbath,
yeah. Sorry.
right?
I didn't know
The
you were
two
asking us a
institutions from
question.
Eden.
An
Yeah.
attack on one
And
is soon followed by an attack on the other.
by attack on the other. But the thing is that as Adventists, we hold the Sabbath in very high regard, but most of our evangelical friends don't want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it.
Yeah,
But they're very concerned about marriage. And if we're involved with them on talking and helping and upholding marriage, and we build relationships and confidence with them, then that gives us a wonderful opportunity to talk about the other institution from Eden, right? And connecting the two, and it opens doors to further dialogue rather than compromise. It's a forum for creating further dialogue about even more important issues.
So here's a question. I've been meaning to ask somebody, and I guess I have you here because you are not only a lawyer, but you're also a devout Christian, and especially from my faith. If Donald Trump would right now pass an executive order for a Sunday law, the entire left would go bonkers, right? However, we know prophetically that both sides are going to get along. And we have assumed that it's going to be natural disasters or something global. How do you see it playing out, perhaps in a different venue than what we've traditionally thought, that it's going to be some global disaster or something that will unite both sides, but politically from a different perspective, how do you see how another way it could play out?
Well, I mean, you could almost create arguments for it that even Adventists might find attractive. The whole pandemic showed that having a rest could actually help restore the earth, right? They had dolphins in the canals in Venice for the first time in, like, decades, and the water was cleaner and the air was cleaner, and you could see why the Sabbath principles laid down in the Old Testament, because that's not just a weekly thing; it's also a
Mm-hmm.
yearly thing, right? Every seven
Mm-hmm.
years, and then every Jubilee year, and the land rests, and people rest, and animals rest, and can we agree that the unfettered, unrestrained capitalistic activity that surrounds us is like killing us in many ways? Like,
Mm-hmm.
people are
Mm-hmm.
anxious and depressed, and there's mental problems, and the gap between rich and poor, and you have to work 24/7, many people feel, to keep up. And so the idea of a Sabbath as an anti-capitalist um,
Mechanism.
barrier
Yeah.
mechanism would be attractive to many
Mm-hmm.
people on the left, right? As an environmental, pro-labor union, pro-working people, slowing down the capitalist onrush. As an Adventist, I'm almost like attracted to the
Yeah,
idea,
I know.
right? And because I actually think that that's part of the message of the Sabbath:
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
environmentalism, rest, not all these things. And the reason we would oppose it is because, look, this is a religious, I think that it would be appropriate for the government to say everybody gets a day rest a week, but it's up to them as to which day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could Sabbath, Sunday, Friday, whatever it is, right? It seems to me physiologically you can show that human beings do better and they flourish better when they get one day rest out of seven.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have
Mm-hmm.
a weekend where people, should be able to rest. But corporate capitalism often undermines that rest, and people just work round the clock, round the week, round the
Mm-hmm.
month, round the year. It's never ending.
I like to
So
tell.
that's,
So one thing,
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Find a common secular bond that everybody can unite around, and perhaps rally around it. Go ahead, Joe.
one thing I would say that I've been thinking about along these lines is the principle of why and I'll just give my own bias here. That R guy you said before, he's my guy, right? The Gipper, right? Ronald Reagan. He's kind of my guy. So I'm like a free market, right? Government hands off type guy.
right.
And so but one of the reasons why I would say, even because like Project 2025 that's gotten talked about a lot, that's what you suggested is basically what they said, right? In their thing, where they said, we'd like this Sunday observance with the labor stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but we think that Jews or other Christian, Sabbatarian Christians should also be able to get that day off. And that's what that bill said. But the reason why I still have an issue with that is kind of twofold. For one, I do think toying around with the idea of the government getting used to acting on the first four commandments, which I just think are God's sphere. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a bad precedent. But then the other is the fact that law cannot change hearts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact is, right now, there's a lot of Christian business owners who absolutely could be closed on Sundays, right? I think of Chick-fil-A. I think very admirably, based on their convictions, they close every Sunday. And so what I would say to my mega Christian nationalist friends or my integralist friends is preach to your own parishes, preach to your own churches and the business owners within them, and like, why aren't you resting on
Yeah.
the day that you think you should rest on, right? And like, I would say is like, I want you to change your heart because I think you should live up to your convictions, and I think it's an hypocrisy when you don't. It's just using the state. I just feel like when it comes to those first four commandments, it's just a slippery slope, that a Pandora's box that I would rather stay closed. Although at some point before Jesus comes, I know it's going to open. But
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. It's nice I like that first table versus second
Mm-hmm.
table distinction. Going back to Aquinas, he would say that the principle of rest is actually taught by the natural law. And I think he's right about that, right? That physiologically, we talked about this before, you can show there's a 7-day cycle that you do better with rest, but you simply can't get that it should be the seventh day
Yeah.
or the first day, right? From the natural law. The seventh
Mm-hmm.
day or the first day. That's a special revelation thing. That's a
Mm-hmm.
creation 7-day thing, or that's a Christ raised from the dead thing. And so, is it possible? I mean, the government already has rules regarding rest, like they manage it in somewhat different ways. If you work more than 40 hours a week, you're supposed to get time and a half, and if that's under federal law. So
Mm-hmm.
that discourages employers from requiring, excessive work. So there's some, as we see this is the problem for Sabbath keepers. We're just like, oh, we want to be against, all notions of Sabbath rest,
Mm-hmm.
anything to do with the government. And we're now in an era where there's environmental collapse, where there's, overwork, where there's mental anxiety and problems. And a solution to this would be some kind of regular rest for everybody. And if we're just saying, no, you can't, the government can't concern itself with rest, we're kind of allying ourselves with corporate America, saying everybody should just, as a legal matter, be required or be allowed to be required. And unfettered capitalism, leads us in that direction. We've got to think about these arguments more carefully,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can acknowledge that the government may have a role in protecting workers and providing rest, but doing so in a way that's religiously neutral and protects everyone's religious convictions and teachings.
That's why I keep mentioning it. It's such a razor thin line when we get it, because you
Yeah,
want to do it right, but if you lean too much on one side, that's where it gets bonkers. I sometimes when I talk to Christian nationalists, I tell them, look, I want a lot of the same things you want. It's just I want it by persuasion and the love of God. You want it by the sword, right? And that's
yeah,
the battle. And so we have to find common ground where we can, but the way we
yeah,
come about it is so different.
And I would say to your point, Dr. Miller, that's granted. And what I would say is like those laws that in a democracy, in a constitutional republic, that we may think somewhat like some laws may go too far here or too far there, but like there's difference between bad law, whatever, within the bounds of of a democracy, and then bad law that violates some higher principle, right? So while I do agree with you that laws about like work weeks and having to take breaks or whatever, like I don't necessarily think these laws. I think some of these laws are really good. And even there's some laws, right? Like again, like maybe taxes are too high or whatever that I may not like it, but I shouldn't cast it necessarily at the same level as the church and state. You know what I mean? Like there's laws
yeah,
that maybe they're bad, but the people chose them, so you live with it. That's
right,
democracy sometimes. So
right,
You got to pick your
yeah,
I
battles.
think that's about, and I guess that's one of the things I'm really taking away from this conversation. That I feel like kind of the underlying things as Christians, we have to be thoughtful citizens, right? And we have to actually engage meaningfully rather than just be like, oh, I'm against this or I'm against that, but like actually, have something that we're for. I like that.
yeah. Well, I think we made a mistake in the last 50 years when we basically told our pastors to stay out of politics and political issues. Because what happened is without our pastors thinking biblically about questions of public morality and social morality and policy, all our members just kind of drifted into their own political
Neutrality.
pockets or
Yeah.
well, I don't know if neutrality is quite the way I would put it. I would
Mm.
say they drifted into the political affiliations connected with their
Uh,
socio-economic, ethnic,
mm-hmm.
demographic, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is a bit of a caricature, but if you're an urban African American, you're a Democrat, and
You
and
ain't
and
black
you're
if you don't
and
vote
you're
for me.
and you support the policies of the Democratic Party. But if you're a
Hmm.
white Midwesterner, then you're a Republican, and
Hmm.
it's not always the same on both sides. But unfortunately, without guidance, biblical, thoughtful guidance, because both parties have positions that we can and should support, and both
Hmm.
parties have positions that we need to oppose.
Yeah.
And if you identify too fully with either party, it shows that your politics is being driven by your partisan connections, your demographic position in society, and not by your biblically reflective thought.
My biggest issue in politics, and I'm talking now amongst our denomination, is when they start getting into personal attacks of the person, whether it's Trump or Biden. When they start, I don't know what they call it. Like personal. I always try to stay on the policy side.
Well, it's a little tricky though, isn't it?
I know.
I think,
Yeah, it is. It is
a few,
because
well, a
like
few minutes ago you said you wouldn't.
no,
let
that's
your
what I was
daughter
going to point.
marry.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't argue my policies that I don't like about him based on that. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, right.
Fair
Know what I
enough,
mean?
yeah.
And so and for me, the reason is then you risk offending people who will not listen to you on the gospel from the other side because you're making it. I have found when I stick to policies, then people of both sides still listen when I talk Bible. And that's what I would love more of our Adventist ministers to at least think about it and do it in their own way. They don't have to do it like I do, but be cognizant of that. Go ahead, Joey.
Well, it's a tricky
I
thing
don't know
because
if
you're gonna. Yeah,
Yeah,
go
no, go
ahead,
ahead.
Joe.
you go ahead. You go first.
Yeah.
No, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Okay, so I was just saying, I don't know if this is pushback, but like a slightly different perspective. Whereas I actually do think the personal character argument is a good argument. Now it's kind of been lost because both sides have given it up. Right? In other words, in the 90s, I think Republicans were 100% vindicated and right to make Bill Clinton's improprieties a major issue. I just read, I think it was in 1998, in the lead up to the 2000 election, the SBC put out a statement urging their members and their leaders to think of personal character and comportment when choosing a leader for the Oval Office. And listen, whatever anyone thinks of W. Bush, and I think there's things that you can criticize, he was a good man, right? I think anybody, like even like some of the things where maybe the Patriot Act went too far, right? Like I do
Right.
believe he is a guy who was a person of moral character. And then, take what how many years it's been since 2008 or whatever when he left, and like now the Republican Party has nominated a guy who's every bit
Right.
as Bill
Battle
Clinton.
Royal.
And so
Yeah.
I would say is like there's not really anybody who can make the character argument except for like the few people who were anti-Clinton and also are anti-Trump. But I think we need more of that, actually. I think, generally speaking, the character of a leader will show up and will affect the nation because I guess how I would say is you can't guarantee every situation that's going to come before a president's desk. But what you can know is like, are we putting someone of character before that
And
position
integrity.
or not? Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, but Bill Clinton did not qualify, and I don't think President Trump does either. I don't think
I
President
think
Biden did either.
Yeah. Then what are you left
well,
with?
but I
Policy.
think, I mean, Biden. I think Biden seemed to have a clearer character than either of those than those other two. I think I would differ Biden more with his policy than
Mm-hmm.
his personal character. Um, so, but
I guess
anyway,
I
it's a
just for the
very good
person
point.
and like I think there are some legitimate criticisms of family dealings and stuff that weren't exactly great. Now, I'm not saying he's the only
Yeah.
person who did it, right? Lots of people in Washington do.
Those are
But I just
complicated,
think
aren't they?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
not the same kind of personal sexual peccadillos and just
Well, and that's
yeah.
why, to me, I said, going back the way I handle it, that's why I have to separate it. Because look, you can find moral flaws on all of them. So then just stick to the policies, what I do publicly, right? Amongst friends, you can talk character, but I'm talking about publicly because as a minister, I'm public. I can't be showing my bias either way. I can talk
what
policy.
About David, Nathan,
I
thou
would
art
say,
the man.
though,
I mean,
Yeah, but that's different. To me, that's different. Trump is not the king of God's nation, right?
Yeah, but he's
Well, what I
he's
would
an
say
example.
is,
All right, King Herod
Yeah,
and
yeah.
John the Baptist. You shouldn't be married to that woman.
Yeah, but he did
Yeah,
that
and
private.
I
He
would
wasn't
say
campaigning against that.
Oh, he
where
did
we
it
see
publicly.
the
That's why
Yeah,
Herod
yeah.
and his wife were upset.
Yeah, upset. Anyway, hey, I want to
hold on.
respect Dr. Miller's time, and I have to go myself
Yeah,
as well. But go
I
ahead.
need to head off. Yeah.
I was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
gonna make one point. Sorry, I was gonna make one point here, and why I think like the Republican Party, because really I think they were the only ones who could have made it right in 2016 up to 2016, without being hypocrites. Although now really they can't. But what we've seen by them abandoning it is, but when you say, well, you can find something on everybody, but when I look at the Republican field in 2024, I don't think that's true. Right? When I look at either what like. You can say whatever you want
Yeah.
about Ron DeSantis. I liked him, but like, at least unless somebody knows something I don't, he seems like a good husband and father. A traditional conservative, right? Nikki Haley, right? The wife of a soldier. I guess I don't know that much about like Chris Christie. I don't know of any scandal that pops out.
But the
they
same was
chose
true for Obama. Obama was a family man, right? You
Mm-hmm,
may not like his policies, but there weren't any personal scandals during his 8 years of presidency. So there are
How could you
decent
say
examples
that?
on both sides.
The tan suit. Just kidding.
Oh, you're going low,
I will say
Gio.
there
You're
were some
going
political
low.
scandals now, but to your point though, he won overwhelmingly in 08. And like I said, I always say I think even though I would never, I mean I wasn't old enough, but I would never have voted for President Obama because I had some major policy issues with him. But I do say in hindsight, he did have, I think, the best chance at really being a unifying president. And yeah, but we'll end it
well,
there.
It wasn't.
Yeah, well,
didn't always happen.
Yeah.
Didn't always
All
happen.
right, so here's my last question, and we'll end on this.
All right.
What do you see happening in the next election? Presidential.
We're all still around for if we have another election. You mean?
Put on your procrastinator
I,
hat.
So it's been disturbing to me, first of all, that there was a second Trump term, given all that we saw, and especially the January 6th shenanigans, which, you can make arguments that he didn't cause them, but there was a lot of rhetoric surrounding it that seemed to be encouraging. And in fact, after the fact, he's embraced it in terms of the pardons, the gathering together of them and the holding them up as heroes. And yet we have another presidency. We have incredible violations of our basic constitutional framework. And yet, as you pointed out, Gio, the public support has generally been mostly positive. And, we would need another episode to get into this. But there's a prophecy at the end of the book of Daniel about the king of the north and the king of the south. And I'm persuaded that the king of the north represents a kind of absolutist, integralist form of government where religion is imposed through the force of the state and there's a moral absolutism. The king of the south is the opposite. It's a secular liberal relativism, French Revolution, communism, left-wing kind of government, right? And these two kings are competing and they go back and forth, pushing against each other. And in the final verses of chapter 11, it talks about the king of the north overflowing and running over, and there's no more resistance, and it is the victor in the end. Not the final end, of course, because we know Michael and the people of God, but in the earthly end. And as we look at what's happening now, the Congress, it's the presidency doing what it wants, the Congress bending its knee because the Congress is cold by republicanism, the Supreme Court largely in conservative hands. It's like the field has been routed. Where is the resistance coming from? It's like we're in those final verses where the King of the North has prevailed, and I don't really see any pushback. Is there going to be a change at the midterms? Like, could I be overstating things? Is the Congress going to go back to the Democrats at the midterms? Maybe, but they don't really seem to be mounting much of an effective resistance to any of this.
Yeah, the polls show they're at the lowest they've been in decades. The Democratic Party. We got to let this man go, Joey. Hurry up.
This is my last point. But what I would say is, at least right now, in my opinion, as someone who is a fan of the Federalist Society, right, and is a fan of the conservative legal movement, that's the resistance, right? And when you look, right, at the way even Trump's appointees, at least from the first term, because they were FedSoc appointees, they believe things about the Constitution and originalism, right? And ACB, right, Amy Coney Barrett, she has not been just a pushover, right? She believes conservative things, and when the administration goes against it, she stands up. Neil Gorsuch, another one, is a civil libertarian. I think he's been a pushback. And even Kavanaugh, and even, I would say the one who is the most, like, outcome-oriented in a way that's makes me uncomfortable is Alito. But, like, Clarence Thomas, right, like, regardless of what you think of him, we know what his position is going to be on any issue because he's probably the most consistent guy. And so I would say in some ways, they're the resistance. And what I'm worried about is that they're undermined, right? That the court and our actual judicial system, which I do think is working, that they find ways of undermining that. But that's just my
but
opinion.
Joey, I agree with you. But Joey, when the resistance is the Christian nationalists, you're kind of in trouble, right? I mean, they're resisting the excesses of his authoritarianism, but most of them in a minute would uphold some version of Christian nationalism. So that's the way I'm seeing it. It's like, there's a resistance here, but the resistance are the people that would probably be happy to crown J.D. Vance and have a Christian nationalism marching down the street. Like, they'd be against his military parade. Like, we have this military parade coming up on his birthday. I mean, this is like classic authoritarian USSR. And I think a lot of these Republicans will be against that, but they'd be in favor probably of a Christian nationalism parade coming down the same street.
Yeah, well, and I guess I
hey, Joey, we got to let this man go.
We'll have a part
the originalist. I don't know if I would see most of those going along with, like, violations of the Constitution, but who knows? We'll see.
All right, we'll save that for part two.
It's a question of how they read the Constitution, though, isn't it? So, and you and I may have different readings of it than them. So, hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. It's good to
thank
talk
you.
with you, and I'm sure we'll do it again someday.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, Dr. Miller, thank you very much. Hang on for just 1 minute.